There is a particular kind of English village that the rest of the world has mostly forgotten about. Not the postcard kind. Not the one with the tea shop that charges £8 for a scone and has a gift shop selling fridge magnets shaped like red telephone boxes. No, the real kind. The kind where the pub has been run by the same family for 4 generations, where the war memorial in the churchyard has last names that still belong to people living on the same street, and where the annual Scarecrow Festival has been held every second Saturday of October since 1963. Fenwick-on-Brook is that village. Population: 340, give or take a few depending on whether old Gerald Parkins has remembered to register himself after moving to his daughter's place and moving back twice. The kind of place where the post office is also the bakery, and the bakery is also where you find out everything that happened in the past week, and the week before that, and frankly most of what happened in 1987. The Fenwick Scarecrow Festival is not famous. It does not trend. It has never been featured on a travel blog written by someone who describes themselves as a content creator and lifestyle curator. It has a hand-painted banner that goes up on the Friday before. It has a raffle with prizes that include a fruit basket and a voucher for the local garden center. And it has, at its absolute center, one scarecrow. Not many scarecrows. Not a competition with categories and judges and rosettes. One scarecrow. Built every year by one man, placed in the middle of the festival green for the duration of the event, and then carefully dismantled on the Sunday evening with the good straw kept for next year. That is the tradition. That has always been the tradition. And this year, the tradition nearly died. Not because of weather, not because of funding, not because the village lost interest. Because of Derek. But we will get to Derek. First, you need to understand Arthur Finch, because without understanding Arthur, none of what happened that Saturday makes any sense at all. And what happened that Saturday, well, the village is still talking about it. Quietly, the way villages talk about things that actually matter, which is to say constantly and with great feeling and always just below the volume at which outsiders might overhear. It was, without question, the best festival Fenwick-on-Brook had ever seen. And it started as the best things usually do, with an old man sitting alone in a field. Arthur Finch turned 78 in August. He celebrated with a Victoria sponge made by his neighbor Patricia, a phone call from his son in Canada that lasted 40 minutes and covered, in order, the weather in Ontario, the weather in Fenwick, the price of heating oil, and a brief but sincere conversation about how Arthur was getting on. His son asked if he needed anything. Arthur said no. His son said he'd come for Christmas. Arthur said good. That was the birthday. Arthur had been making the festival Scarecrow since 1966. He had missed exactly 1 year, 1987, when his wife Margaret was in hospital for 3 weeks in October, and he sat with her every day without exception. The village understood. They didn't have a scarecrow that year. They didn't try to replace him or find someone else. They just didn't have one, and they noted the gap. And when Margaret came home and Arthur came back the following year with a scarecrow wearing a hat that looked remarkably like the one Margaret always wore to church, nobody said anything about it. They just looked at it and understood. That is the kind of village Fenwick-on-Brook is. Now Arthur's hands had been giving him trouble since the spring. Arthritis, the doctor said. Manageable, the doctor said. Arthur nodded, collected his prescription, and didn't mention it again to anyone. But Patricia noticed that he'd stopped carrying his own shopping bags. And Brian at the pub noticed that Arthur now held his pint with both hands. And Fenwick-on-Brook being what it was, these small noticings passed quietly between people like a note being folded and refolded. And eventually, everybody knew without anybody having said a word. The question, unspoken but very much present, was whether Arthur would be able to build the scarecrow this year. Arthur had not raised this question himself. Arthur did not intend to raise this question. As far as Arthur was concerned, the question did not exist. On the Thursday before the festival, he set up his table at the edge of the festival green. Same spot he'd used for 60 years. He laid out his materials: good clean straw, Hessian sacking, an old shirt that had belonged to his father, a pair of corduroy trousers, twine, wire, 2 buttons for eyes, and a battered felt hat he'd found at a jumble sale in 1971 and kept in tissue paper ever since. He sat down on his stool, picked up the wire and began. His hands shook a little, not badly, but enough. People walked past. People smiled at him. Several people said good morning, lovely day for it, looking forward to the festival. Nobody sat down beside him. Nobody offered to help, not because they didn't want to, but because to offer would have been to say out loud what nobody wanted to say, which was that they weren't sure he could manage it alone, and saying that to Arthur Finch would have been, well, you just didn't. You knew you didn't. So Arthur sat alone at his table with his shaking hands and his 60 years of straw and twine, and he got on with it. By Friday afternoon, he had the frame done. By Friday evening, he had the body stuffed and shaped. Saturday morning, festival day, he still needed the head, the hat, the finishing details, the face. The parts that always took the most time. The parts that required the most precision. He arrived at his table at 7 in the morning. The festival didn't open until 10. He was sitting there, working, when the plain dark car pulled up at the far edge of the field. Derek Howell had been appointed chairman of the Fenwick-on-Brook Parish Council in March, following the retirement of Janet Moss, who had held the role for 11 years and was, by all accounts, excellent at it. Derek was not Janet Moss. Derek was 44 years old, worked in business development for a company in the nearest town that nobody in the village could quite explain, and had moved to Fenwick-on-Brook 2 years ago with his wife and 2 children because, as he had told everyone at least once, we wanted the authentic rural experience. The authentic rural experience, as it turned out, was something Derek wanted very much to improve. He had spent his 6 months as chairman producing a 17-page document titled Fenwick-on-Brook Community Events, a strategic modernization framework which proposed, among other things, replacing the hand-painted festival banner with a branded visual identity, introducing a corporate sponsorship tier for local businesses, adding a stage with amplified music because data shows footfall increases with live entertainment. And this was the one that made old Gerald Parkins put his tea down very slowly and deliberately, removing the single central scarecrow in favor of what Derek described as a decentralized scarecrow experience, where community members each contribute a personal scarecrow, reflecting diverse individual narratives and increasing social media shareability. Brian at the pub had read this document. He had then read it again. He had then set it down, looked at the ceiling for a moment and said, very quietly, he wants to get rid of Arthur's scarecrow. The village had thoughts about this. The village kept its thoughts mostly to itself. This was not passivity. This was strategy. Fenwick-on-Brook had been here for 600 years. It had seen things come and it had seen things go. It knew how to wait. Derek arrived at the festival green at 8:30 on Saturday morning with a clipboard, a high-visibility vest he had ordered online and did not need, and a Bluetooth earpiece that he was not on a call with but wore anyway. He walked the perimeter. He consulted his clipboard. He counted the stalls. He made a note about the banner, still the hand-painted one, he observed, with visible displeasure. He walked toward the center of the green where Arthur was working at his table. He looked at Arthur. He looked at the half-finished scarecrow. He looked at his clipboard. "We're putting the main activity zone over by the car park this year," Derek said. "Better flow. I'll need this area clear by 9:15 for the sponsored family zone." Arthur looked up at him. "I'm in my usual spot," Arthur said. "Yes, I understand that, but we're trying something new this year, and the data suggests." "I've been in this spot since 1966, Arthur said. "Margaret chose it." A pause. "Who is Margaret?" Derek said. Arthur looked at him for a moment. Then he looked back at his scarecrow and picked up his twine. Derek made a note on his clipboard. At 8:45, Derek found the festival's 2 volunteers, young Gemma from the post office and her boyfriend Tom, and told them that the scarecrow display was being repositioned and that they should let Arthur know. Gemma and Tom looked at each other. Then they went and found something else to do on the other side of the field. Derek made another note. At 9:05, he walked back toward Arthur's table, this time with the specific intention of being firmer about it. That was when he noticed there was someone sitting at the table with Arthur. The plain, dark car at the edge of the field had arrived quietly. No motorcade, no police outriders, no announcement, just a car parking at the grass verge with the careful politeness of someone who didn't want to block the lane, and a man getting out wearing dark trousers, a wax jacket, and boots that had clearly seen a proper amount of outdoor use. 2 other men got out with him. They stood at a respectful distance, hands in front of them, eyes scanning the perimeter, professional stillness. They had the look of men who were very good at being unobtrusive and were doing so quite deliberately. The man in the wax jacket walked toward the festival green. He walked past the banner. He walked past the raffle ticket table where Patricia was just setting up. He walked past the stall that sold homemade jam, and the stall that sold locally turned wooden bowls, and the stall that Brian from the pub had set up to sell sausage rolls at a price Brian described as community-spirited, and Patricia described as extortionate. He walked to the center of the green. He stopped at Arthur's table. He looked at the scarecrow, the frame, the body, the old shirt, the corduroy trousers, the head taking shape in Arthur's careful, slightly unsteady hands. He said, "That's good straw. Where do you source it?" Arthur, without looking up, said, "Same farm, 60 years, Ted Marston's place, top of the hill." The man nodded. He looked at the table, he looked at the materials, he looked at Arthur's hands. He said, "Would an extra pair of hands help?" Arthur looked up. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Arthur said, "You any good with wire?" The man sat down. Now, here is the thing about Fenwick-on-Brook. People began to notice. Of course they did. It is a village of 340 people, and everyone knows everyone's car and everyone's coat and everyone's way of walking across a field. Word moved at the speed that word moves in small places, which is to say faster than you would think possible given that nobody appeared to be communicating. Patricia noticed first. She was unwrapping her jam jars, and she looked up and she looked again, and she put down the jam jar very carefully and said nothing to anyone for a full 2 minutes, which for Patricia was extraordinary self-restraint. Brian noticed second. He was setting up his sausage roll situation, and he squinted across the field and then went very still, and then slowly, methodically, continued setting up his sausage roll situation, because Brian had been in Fenwick-on-Brook his whole life, and he understood instinctively that you do not make a fuss about a thing if making a fuss would ruin the thing. Gemma noticed third and immediately took out her phone. Tom put his hand gently on her arm. She put her phone away. She understood. The man and the village knew who the man was. The village was absolutely certain who the man was, and the village had collectively decided without a meeting or a vote or even a conversation that they were not going to say anything about it. The man was sitting at Arthur's table, in the mud and the morning damp, working wire through hessian with a focus and a lack of fuss that suggested he had done practical things with his hands before and did not find them beneath him. Arthur was showing him how to shape the head. The man was listening carefully. This is when Derek Howell arrived back at the table with his clipboard and his high-visibility vest and his intention to be firmer. Derek looked at Arthur. Derek looked at the man helping Arthur. Derek processed this information. Derek's clipboard lowered approximately 4 inches. Derek said. The man looked up. Derek looked at the man. The man waited politely. Derek said, "I was just there's a I had a note about the," he gestured vaguely at his clipboard. "The positioning." The man said, "Arthur tells me this has been his spot since 1966. Seems like the right place for it." Derek opened his mouth. Derek closed his mouth. "Carry on," the man said pleasantly, and looked back at the scarecrow head he was working on. Derek walked away. He walked quite briskly. The clipboard was very quiet for the rest of the morning. To be fair to Derek, and Fenwick-on-Brook is a fair-minded village mostly, he did not give up easily. This was, depending on your perspective, either a sign of admirable determination or a sign that Derek had not fully read the room. Given that the room was an entire village that had closed ranks around an elderly scarecrow maker and a royal visitor with the quiet efficiency of a dry stone wall going up, it was probably the latter. At 9:30, Derek approached Gemma with a revised site map and asked her to redirect visitors away from the central green and toward the activation zone near the car park, which featured a branded pull-up banner Derek had paid for himself and a stand where children could make their own miniature scarecrows out of craft materials Derek had ordered from an online wholesale supplier. Gemma took the site map. She looked at it carefully. She folded it in half. She put it in her coat pocket. She then directed every single person who arrived through the main gate straight toward the center of the green. "Is that where the main event is?" one visitor asked. "Today it is," Gemma said. At 10:15, Derek found Tom and asked him to move the rope barriers to create a clearer pedestrian corridor away from Arthur's area. Tom looked at the rope barriers. Tom looked at Derek. Tom said he would get right on it. Tom then went and had a sausage roll from Brian and did not touch the rope barriers. At 10:45, Derek approached a man he did not recognize who was standing calmly near Arthur's table, drinking a cup of tea that Patricia had brought over. "Excuse me," Derek said. "This area is reserved for festival personnel only." The man looked at Derek. Derek looked at the man. One of the two other men who had arrived in the plane car materialized, very quietly, at Derek's left shoulder. "I'm with Arthur," the man with the tea said, gesturing at the scarecrow maker. Derek nodded. Derek walked away. Derek found a spot near the edge of the field and stood there for a while looking at his clipboard without writing anything on it. Meanwhile, at the center of the green, something was happening that Derek's strategic modernization framework had not accounted for. People were gathering. Not because they had been directed there. Not because there was a sign or a stage or an announcement over a PA system that Derek had tried to hire and had been told the village didn't want. They were gathering because word had moved through the field the way scent moves through a room, gradually, undeniably, and impossible to stop once it had started. An older couple from the next village over had come because their daughter had texted them. A young woman with a pram had drifted over from the jam stall. A group of primary school children on a Saturday outing were being steered very deliberately by their teacher toward the center of the green. Several people were standing at what they clearly judged to be a respectful distance, watching, not crowding, not shouting, not doing anything except being present in the way that English people are present at things that matter quietly, with their hands in their pockets, in the cold October air. Arthur and the man worked. The scarecrow was almost finished. The felt hat, kept since 1971 in tissue paper, was waiting. Derek looked at his clipboard one more time. Then he put it under his arm. Then he went and stood near Brian's sausage roll stall and bought one and ate it and did not say anything to anyone, which was, everyone agreed later, the best decision Derek had made all day. At 11:20, Arthur Finch set down his tools. He looked at the scarecrow on the table in front of him. Then he looked at the man beside him. Then he picked up the felt hat, the one from the jumble sale in 1971, the one that had lived in tissue paper for 53 years, and he put it on the scarecrow's head with the careful deliberateness of a man performing a ritual, which is exactly what it was. The scarecrow had a face made of hessian and button eyes, and an expression that was somehow both stern and kind, which Arthur had managed every year without being able to explain how. It wore the old shirt and the corduroy trousers. It had a posture, if a scarecrow can be said to have a posture, of absolute certainty about its own right to be exactly where it was. It looked, Brian said later at the pub, like someone who had been standing in that field for 600 years and intended to continue. The man beside Arthur stood up and helped him carry the scarecrow to the post that had been set into the ground at the center of the green. The same post, reset every year in the same hole, more or less. Arthur had dug it himself until 3 years ago when his knees started. Since then, Tom did the digging on the Thursday evening without being asked, because Tom had grown up watching Arthur and understood that this was simply something that happened. They lifted the scarecrow onto the post together. Arthur stepped back, he looked at it. The man in the wax jacket stepped back, he looked at it. Around them, the gathering of people, quiet, cold, October morning English people with their hands in their pockets and their sausage rolls and their thermoses of tea, also looked at it. Nobody started the applause, it just started. It was not the applause of a crowd that has been prompted by a sign or a compare or a countdown. It was the applause of people who felt something and needed to put it somewhere. It was the kind of applause that takes you slightly by surprise even when you're the one doing it. Arthur stood in front of his scarecrow and the applause washed over him, and he stood very straight, which for a 78-year-old man with arthritis in both hands was its own kind of statement. Patricia was crying. She would later deny this. The evidence is against her. Brian was not crying. Brian was looking at the scarecrow with the expression of a man trying to identify an emotion he does not have a word for and does not particularly want to examine too closely. He continued eating his sausage roll. Gemma had her phone out. This time Tom did not stop her. This time it felt right. She took one photograph, Arthur standing in front of the scarecrow, the man beside him, the crowd behind them, the October sky, and she put her phone away again. She never posted it. She still has it. The man in the wax jacket stood beside Arthur for a moment and looked at the scarecrow and then looked at Arthur and said something that only Arthur heard. Arthur nodded. William did not make a speech. This is important. This is, in many ways, the whole point. He did not ask for a microphone or a moment or an announcement. He did not stand up in front of the gathered crowd and say something composed and official about the importance of rural heritage and community spirit, the kind of thing that gets written down and quoted in press releases and sounds true without being true in the way that actually matters. He stood next to an old man in a muddy field, in front of a scarecrow wearing a 53-year-old felt hat. And he said what he said to Arthur, and Arthur nodded, and that was it. What he said, Arthur told Patricia that evening, and Patricia, to her eternal credit, told exactly one other person, which in Fenwick-on-Brook means everyone knew by Sunday morning, was this: your wife had good taste in spots. Arthur had laughed. Properly laughed, the kind that catches you off guard, the kind that sounds like someone much younger. The two men from the plane car were already moving quietly toward the vehicle. The man in the wax jacket shook Arthur's hand, both hands, firmly for a moment, and then he walked back across the field the way he had come, past the jam stall and the wooden bowls and Brian's sausage rolls and the hand-painted banner, and he got into the plain dark car. And the plain dark car drove away down the lane and was gone. The village watched it go. Then the village turned back to the festival, because the festival was still happening, because it was only midday, because there were raffle tickets to buy and jam to taste, and the question of whether old Gerald Parkins had remembered to renew his entry in the Scarecrow raffle needed answering, and the business of the day continued. The Scarecrow stood in the center of the green. Derek Howell left at 2 o'clock. He said he had another commitment. Nobody asked what it was. His high-visibility vest was found hanging on the gate post the following morning. Patricia put it in the lost property box at the post office, where it remained uncollected for 6 weeks before she quietly donated it to the village hall. His 17-page strategic modernization framework was discussed at the next parish council meeting in November. After a brief and civil conversation, it was noted for the record that the Fenwick-on-Brook Scarecrow Festival had been held every second Saturday of October since 1963 and had been, by all available measures, a success. The framework was filed. The filing cabinet was in a room that was also used for storing folding chairs. It was not retrieved. Arthur Finch went home at 4 o'clock when the lights started going. Patricia drove him, as she usually did, and they didn't talk much in the car, which was fine. He was tired in the good way. The way you are tired when a thing has gone as it should. He sat in his kitchen with a cup of tea and looked out the window at the garden where Margaret's rose bush was losing its last October leaves. He thought about what the man had said. Your wife had good taste in spots. He thought that was true. She had always been right about where to put things. The Scarecrow stayed up for a week. On the Sunday evening, Arthur went back to the green with Tom, who brought a thermos, and they carefully dismantled it the way Arthur had always dismantled it, taking the good straw out first, folding the old shirt, rolling the corduroy trousers, wrapping the felt hat back in its tissue paper for next year. Same again next year, Tom said. Same again, Arthur said. They drove home in Tom's van, the straw in the back, the hat on Arthur's lap, the village quiet around them in the way that villages are quiet on Sunday evenings in October, which is a very particular kind of quiet that has nothing lonely about it. Brian wrote Best Festival, yet on the pub's chalkboard outside. He left it up until Christmas.